In this video, we'll discuss histograms. Please open the Glanum Photoshop file. This is a photo I took in southern France of some ancient Roman ruins. We're using this as an example because it's poorly exposed. The sun is behind the pediment here, and it causes this silhouette-like effect. To visualize the tonal range of the image, let's open the histogram window. Go to the window menu, choose histogram, and then drag it out and close the navigator. The histogram is a statistical representation of the brightness levels in the image. The horizontal axis represents brightness. It starts here at pure black, and it goes up through middle gray all the way up to pure white. The vertical axis represents the number of pixels in each one of these levels. So what we're seeing here in this image are two peaks, one peak in the shadows and one peak in the highlights. There's essentially no information in the midtones of this image. We're seeing the shadow information down here and in the building itself. There's actually information in the sky, but it's a bit too bright to really perceive it here. Let's see if we can shift this information using the brightness contrast adjustment. Go to the image menu under adjustments and choose it here. Watch what happens to the histogram when I make this image brighter. This peak starts to slide off the histogram to the right, and this peak starts to spread out into the midtones. If I increase it all the way, we actually lose all of the information that was there initially in the highlights, and the sky becomes pure white. But the shadow information is spread out and it looks a lot better. Let's see what happens if we darken the image all the way. We get the opposite effect, where the shadow information is being pushed off the edge of the histogram, and the highlight information is being spread out across the midtones. We start to see some of the clouds that are in the sky and how the sun is right behind here making this illuminated. So neither one of these extremes is really desirable in this image. Contrast. If we decrease the contrast, what happens is the peaks are pulled slightly closer together. And that looks a little bit better. If we increase the contrast, the peaks are pushed further apart, and we get something that looks more like a silhouette. That's not what I'm aiming for here, so I'll go all the way down here to the minimum contrast and click OK. But I think we could still do better. Go to the image menu under Adjustments and choose Shadows Highlights. I'm going to start at 0 in each of them. And let's watch carefully what happens to the histogram and what happens to the image. If I increase this shadow slider, what happens is the shadow peak is moving over to the right into the midtones. And as we do that, we see more and more detail in the architecture. If we increase the highlights amount, look at what happens to the peak on the right. It's being pulled towards the center. So we're starting to see more detail in the sky. I'll leave it there and click OK. Finally, let's take a look at the levels. Go to Image Adjustments, Levels. Here's the same histogram essentially. And this represents the shadow area, the midtones, and the highlights. So we're a lot better off now than we were initially. However, we're not taking advantage of the full dynamic range inherent in this file. There are essentially no pixels in this area, so we don't have the darkest shadows represented. So drag this slider over until it starts to move into the graph. If you go too far, look at what happens. All of the pixels here would be pure black if I were to drag it all the way over. And that's not what I want. I just want this to cut into the graph a little bit so I have at least some of the pixels are pure black. Similarly, over here, if you drag this slider over to the left, more and more of the pixels become pure white. All of this stuff on the graph becomes pure white. And that's not what I want either. I just want to see some pure white in the image. Maybe right in this area. That's fine. The midpoint here can be shifted. And that essentially brightens or darkens the image as more of the pixels have to be stretched out to be between middle gray and pure white. I think I want some contrast in the image, so I'm going to leave it around 0.97. Of course, 1 is where it initially started, so I'll click OK. So our histogram looks much better. We have information spread out over the whole dynamic range. We can see detail in the architecture and in the sky. However, notice that there are gaps in the histogram. This is because our initial information had to be spread out over this range, and there really wasn't enough to begin with. So we're getting this undesirable banding that occurs here. This is missing information. So we don't have continuous tonality in this image, but I'd say it's much better than where we started. Let's take a look at the initial image by choosing File, Revert, and then go back by choosing Edit, Undo Revert. So you can get a before and after view.